We just reviewed the RTX 4070 Ti Super, and now we're reviewing the 7600 XT. Bonus, I get to go home and sleep after this. We spend like 2 days. Anyway, we're gonna be reviewing the 7600 XT. It has double the memory of the original 7600. It is $330. That's a big price jump considering the price class the 7600 was already in, which was 270 bucks. So going up to 330, pretty big change. And then that's pending, obviously, the partner models and seeing what they land at. But we're on a tear right now with kind of iterating and gradually adding to our GPU test suite. So we just added Cyberpunk RT for the 4070 Ti Super review. You can see the methodology there on the discussion about it. That's in here too. And then we also just added Baldur's Gate 3 back in for another 2023 title that is particularly relevant at this class of card. Something like a 4070 Ti Super, it didn't really matter. You're gonna be CPU bound in most cases anyway, or just at silly frame rate for Baldur's Gate. But for this one, it's particularly relevant. We also added power efficiency testing yesterday, and we're using that for the 76XT as well. That is actually important for this card because in addition to the memory change, the only other meaningful change is that the power budget has increased, which means higher power consumption. We'll see on the efficiency impact, but that's gonna encourage higher clocks. So there should be differences even in scenarios where the memory is going to be irrelevant because maybe not leveraging it. But otherwise, the CPU count's the same, the stream processor count is the same, the memory interface is the same, so it's capacity and power budget, ergo frequency, that are changing. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace, and visiting squarespace.com/gamersnexus will give you 10% off your first purchase with them. We've built a number of our own websites with Squarespace, where we list catastrophic PC hardware failures to inform subscribers of those failures. We also built our store website with Squarespace using its built-in e-commerce tools, and of course, we built a website for our CEO, Snowflake, because she demanded our audience know who really runs the show. Get to the core of your idea and spend less time on web design by signing up at squarespace.com/gamersnexus or click the link below. Let's start with setting the stage for a quick pricing update. If you haven't checked lately, Jeremy on the team put together this quick reference table for you all for GPUs that might be relevant in this price range. We averaged the price of several of the cheapest cards for each SKU. One of these only had one available because it's basically gone, but we eliminated the outliers that were high priced, like those by third-party sellers. The RX 7600 is currently averaging about 274 bucks, so it's still near the launch price. The RX 7700 XT, the prior next class up, is $454 now, and the 7600 XT will be determined at launch. You should maybe see those prices today, but it should be about $330. Where you can still find the 6600, it's about $213, which definitely keeps it relevant. The A750 is also super relevant and is as low as $190 now, but typically around $200 to $210 or so. The 6650 XT is also relevant at $260, as is the 6700 XT, which is a direct price alternative to the 7600 XT, and it runs 12 gigabytes of memory. That's more likely to be utilized than the 16 on the 7600 XT. NVIDIA's closest competition remains the RTX 4060. It hasn't launched anything near the A750 price class yet for this generation. As always, other options might include the used market, but for AMD, looking at new cards, its fiercest competition is really going to be itself from prior generations. It's still contending with whatever remains of the 6000 series inventory. Definitely should be dwindling by now, but it's still out there. And otherwise, the A750 is worth paying attention to, but remember that that one is still kind of variable. We posted a video maybe about a month ago doing a 1-year revisit of Intel Arc, where we spent the entire video talking about the drivers. So if you haven't been updated lately, that's worth checking out because they have improved a lot, but they still have some issues. All right, so for specs, this is, again, functionally identical other than those two characteristics, the power and the memory capacity. So don't expect massive swings, and those that you see will be from one of those two characteristics. And we'll look into the power consumption a little bit later in this review. So let's get straight into the testing. We'll just run the power efficiency stuff first. This is brand new for us. We explained this in the 4070 Ti Super review in depth and had a lot more charts, but we'll just be showing one initial chart here for today for the 7600 XT, partly for time reasons, but also partly because the one Starfield chart really does tell most of the story for the 7600 XT for efficiency. And again, this is all brand new testing for us, so we will be changing and iterating on this. As a reminder, this is an FPS per watt, or effectively frames per joule. Higher is better, and the RX 7600 XT is the worst on this chart, down at 0.27 FPS per watt. That has it behind the original 7600, which was more efficient in this test by 12%. Interestingly, there was about a 12% change at most in Starfield between these cards, so it scaled at least fairly close to 1-to-1 for performance increase in this particular game, but that still makes it clear where AMD got its gains, which is blasting more power with the card now 40 watts higher in total power consumption. The 10-point highs won't be charted separately this time, but for those, we landed at 229 watts for the 76 XT and 196 for the 7600. And if you watch nothing else from the 4070 Ti Super review, check out the efficiency section for more information on this new testing. We also have the 4060 we'll be adding to these charts in the next run. The first summary charts look at the RX 7600 XT versus the RX 7600. Remember, the power budget drives part of this, with the memory driving the larger numbers, but only in scenarios where the memory is actually utilized. Cyberpunk with ray tracing is recently added to our testing. With medium settings, we saw about an 11% increase at 1080p with RT, whereas we saw a significant increase of 34% with 1440p. Now, at 1440p, that's not a playable frame rate, so in that respect, it doesn't matter, but percentage-wise, it serves its academic purpose, which is illustrating that the memory can have an impact when constrained. It's just that the card, at a core level, isn't fast enough for the memory to be relevant here despite the improvement. It's still unplayable. On to the rest of the games. Generally speaking, we're seeing about 5.5% uplift at 4K where tested, and about 7% uplift at 1440p and 1080p. Some breakouts include F1 at 10% for 4K, and Starfield at 12% for 1080p. RT uplift was generally within the same range, aside from Cyberpunk's more intensive settings. If we eliminate Cyberpunk from the averaging, that brings the approximate improvement down closer to 5% from 7%. And that's in exchange for 22% more money, so not great. And the scenarios where you need that memory while also still being in playable territory are going to be rare. The next summary has to be broken into two pieces. We're presenting RT separately from Rasterized testing. As we explained in the 4070 Ti Super review, we do this because we try to keep as much of the math as possible in the direction of percent increase. Anyway, here are the RT results when moving from the RX 7600 XT to the RTX 4060. The scale is insane for Cyberpunk. With the newly added testing, we accommodated both Cyberpunk with Ultra RT and with Medium RT, and we did that because we noticed increase in RT load on the GPU disproportionately favors NVIDIA, which is a real advantage, so we represent it, but we wanted to represent both options fairly. At 1080p with RT Ultra, we saw an 85% uplift. The 7600 XT compared to the 4060 here is crumbling under this much load. The 1440p result really isn't fully representative of the differences because the cards are both so overloaded that they are totally unplayable without any upscaling assistance, and even then it'd be rough. So the nature of being overloaded is that the FPS numbers start skewing, even still though at 60%. With the lower and reduced medium RT settings, the RTX 4060 maintains an advantage of about 30%, still significant. In Dying Light 2, the RTX 4060 has about a 26 to 33% advantage. After that, we have 3 lighter RT workloads that fall below 15% improvement for the RTX 4060. This gives you a fairly representative picture of the two types of RT titles right now, those that supplement raster graphics and those that front-load RT visuals. It's up to you on what kind of games you play with regard to whether this matters. With Rasterized benchmarks only, and now looking at the percentage improvement in the 7600 XT against the 4060, with the 7600 XT going in the positive direction, we see an average wash between them. When it's better, the 7600 XT tends to be about 3 to 5% better over on the right. When it's worse, it tends to be about 2% to 5% worse. Generally speaking, it most consistently did worse in 4K with games that are lighter. Tomb Raider, GTA, and Final Fantasy won't meaningfully utilize that extra VRAM, if at all, so it provides no value. As such, and particularly in Final Fantasy where we tend to see NVIDIA disproportionately favored, counter to Starfield, which disproportionately favors AMD, it's the core specs of the GPU that matter more than the VRAM. In the 2023 remake of Resident Evil 4, the RX 7600 XT ran at 72.7 FPS average against the 69.9 FPS of the 7600. Normally, we'd round those two numbers, but we need every fraction of a frame of difference to even begin to tell these two cards apart unless memory bound. The 7600 XT's lead is 4%. It's actually lower than what we were seeing with the 4070 Ti Super at 1080p levels of uplift territory when compared to the 4070 Ti yesterday. The 7600 XT's closest NVIDIA competition would be the RTX 4060 at 68.8 FPS average. That's just below the 7600, and there's no meaningful difference to frame pacing. It's between the two for price here. The RTX 4060 Ti 8GB card is about $390 to $400, so it's 20% more expensive than MSRP for the 7600 XT. and about 24% more performance in average FPS, up at 90. As for the 6600 XT comparison from last generation, it doesn't really meaningfully move the needle. It's not perfectly linear either, but there's not a big change here. At 1080p, the RX 7600 XT's 110 FPS average led the 7600 by a staggering, mind-blowing 4.1%. We were worried we'd have to break out the double digits for this review, but fortunately it looks like we might not have to, because as we all know, numbers above 10 are in finite supply. We just wastefully used one right there, saying the number 10. That was another one. Rumor has it that this is also why NVIDIA launched its 4070 Ti Super, to protect the supply of double-digit numbers. As for competition, the 4060 ends up right between them when compared to the newest test run. They're about the same, including in 1% lows. The 4060 Ti 8GB runs about 28% ahead of the 76XT at 20% price bump here. Intel's A750 is due another round of testing with its current beta drivers, but as of 10 days ago with the release drivers, the A750 was clocked at 105 FPS average in this test. That has it just below the 7600 baseline card. Intel currently has a $70 to $80 price advantage over the 7600, so this is fiercely competitive here. It's still more sporadic than NVIDIA and AMD for game-to-game reliability, but it has significantly improved from launch. Actually, we have a 1 year later revisit video if you want to learn more about how Intel has updated its drivers. Starfield is up next. Tested at 1440p, this 2023 title has the 7600 XT at 51.7 FPS average and the 7600 non-XT at 46.6 FPS average. It's about an 11% swing to the XT, which is far more than we saw in many of the other games tested today. It's actually the most exciting it'll get. F1 is also in this range later on. This result positions the 7600 as behind the 4060, which itself is behind the 3060 Ti, and then the 7600 XT is behind the 4060 Ti. The 4060 Ti leads it by about 15% here. At 1080p, the RX 7600 XT leads by 12% over the original 7600. This is significant in comparison to other positions we've seen in this testing. Unfortunately, that doesn't show up in many other places, and the 7600 XT ends up about equal to a 6700 XT here, with the 7600 behind the 4060. On to Baldur's Gate 3, we started running an entirely new test for this since it's been updated so much since our last round, but in the last couple hours before posting this while running the new cards, we got 6 cards through, and we noticed that overall the results aren't too different since September. We're still rerunning everything, building new charts, but for purposes of giving you as much referential data as possible while we still build this out, we are including the old data too. Anything marked 124 is directly comparable. Some quick examples though, at 4K here, the 7700 XT has improved 3.8% from the September version of the game, with the 4060 not too different from its original result. For directly comparable data at 4K, the 7600 XT is about 5% better than the 7600 as freshly tested, and roughly equal to the 4060. The 4060 Ti's 47 FPS average result gives it a strong lead over the new XT as well. 1440p is up now, old to new, because that's more interesting than the 7600 XT apparently. We saw a 3.5% uplift in the 7600 since September, 4% in the 4060 since September, and 3.2% for the 3060. We also saw 7.6% for the 7700 XT. It's interesting data to have as well, but for direct comparisons with our new data, the 7600 XT leads the 7600 by the same predictable amount we've seen a few times now, with the 4060 sitting about tied with it once again. Dying Light 2 from 2022 is up next. In this one, the 7600 XT ran at 58.9 FPS average. Again, we'll need every one of those digits. That's as compared to the 7600's 56.7, a staggering 3.88% difference. If AMD had pulled in NVIDIA and done a price-for-price swap, we'd be more neutral towards that change. But a price hike for under 4% is simply not worth it in this scenario. The A750 manages to outperform the 7600 and sits just behind the 7600 XT, including with roughly equivalent lows. It's great positioning for Intel's GPU and shows driver maturity as well. NVIDIA's 4060 is between the 7600 and 7600 XT as well, with indistinguishably different lows. The 4060 Ti leads the 7600 XT by 17% here, so its advantage has diminished in this game. At 1080p, the RX 7600's 86 FPS average allows the new 7600 XT a lead of 6.5%. That's so exciting. We can't wait to pay 22% more money for that. NVIDIA's 4060 sits between these two again, so this is perhaps one of the limpest games of a leapfrog since the launch of Skylake number 39. The A770 is also between the 7600 XT and the 7600, with the A750 behind a bit. 4060 Ti again sets the ceiling for this group of cards. None of the cards on the chart would be worth upgrading from one of these. You'd have to go further back, like maybe to a 1050 Ti. And at that point, anything's a huge upgrade, so having a percent difference doesn't matter. You might as well just go by the relative between your modern options. Now we're moving to our older and reliable set of benchmarks, which allows us to have years of comparative data against older cards. These are mostly useful for rapidly establishing scaling performance. Although we're adding new games, we won't necessarily be replacing all of the old suite along with the new ones. We might run them partly in tandem to give us more percent scaling numbers to work with. It's also useful for seeing scaling at things like 4K with a more medium workload. Speaking of, here it is. At 4K, the 7600 XT ran at 51 FPS average, behind the 4060's 54 FPS result, and ahead of the 7600's 49 FPS average result. Wait, sorry, 48.8. It's a 3.5% advantage. So, great. Maybe AMD can sponsor another F1 team with all the extra money per XT they sell. Intel's A750 runs at 49 FPS average here, with lows actually in step with the average. That has it between the 7600 and 7600 XT while costing significantly less if you're willing to deal with the occasional Intel Arc driver issues, some of which are not resolvable by the user. At 1440p, the 7600 XT's 102 FPS average has it 2.5% ahead of the 7600, tied with the RTX 4060, and meaningfully ahead of the A750 this time. This isn't interesting, so let's move on. In F1 at 4K, the RX 7600 XT ran at 62 FPS average, leading the 4060 by 8.6%, and the 7600 by 10.3%. That's at least a meaningful change. It's not worth the money for it, but it's one of those sparingly used double-digit numbers, and we haven't seen many of those this time. This seems to align with the resolution bump, which is likewise reflected in the lows of the 7600 versus the 7600 XT. The XT does a better job for frame time pacing here. As for the 4060 Ti 8GB, that landed at 73 FPS average, a lead over the 7600 XT of about 18%. The Intel A750's 67 FPS average result also leads the 7600 XT here. At 1440p, the RX 7600 XT's 111 FPS average result leads the 7600's 103 FPS average by 8.3%, so F1 seems to just scale better between these two. The A750 is down alongside the 7600, with the A770 up with the 7600 XT. NVIDIA's RTX 4060 is between the two RX 7600 cards, creating options basically every couple of FPS in this area. The total range encompassing all of these models is relatively narrow, so it'll ultimately come down to other features or to just price at time of purchase. At 1080p, the RX 7600 XT leads the 7600 by 3.3%, with the 4060 about tied with the 7600. The A750 runs slower than the 7600 here, down at 134 FPS average, but with acceptable lows. It's similar to the 2070 Super if you look at its positioning, but AMD's 7600 XT scaling has reduced as we've dropped the resolution with this game, which makes sense given that most of the improvement is theoretically in the memory. In Rainbow Six Siege at 4K, the RX 7600 XT ran at 82 FPS average, leading the 7600 by 1.2%. Great. That's at 4K, so not expecting a lot more as we continue. The RTX 4060 is about tied with these results. They are basically all within run-to-run variants. You could effectively just random number generate these if you gave it a normal variable range for the test passes. The 4060 Ti leads more meaningfully, although it has its own issues with getting embarrassed by the 3060 Ti. The A750 falls behind in this one, but given the new pricing, it's not bad as a value position at 4K. At 1440p, the RX 7600 XT has about a 1.6% lead over the RX 7600. Now, if we worked at AMD, we'd want that number to sound more impressive, so here's how to do it. In the 4K test, the 7600 XT was 1.2% better than the 7600. In this test, it's 1.6% better. So, the percent increase is actually 33%, which sounds a lot better than a 0.4 percentage point difference, and it's still technically correct, which is the only kind of correct that matters for marketing. The RTX 4060 is just behind the RX 7600 baseline card, and the A750 is further down the stack than its proportional ranking in some of the other games. Final Fantasy XIV is up now. At 4K, the RX 7600 XT ran at 47 FPS average, leading the original 7600 by all of 1.7%. The A750 actually leads both of these, including in lows, with a 48.8 FPS average. The 4060 is ahead of that at 53 for 4K, and that establishes a 13% lead or so for the 4060 over the 7600 XT. 4060 Ti's 63.6 FPS average result produces a 19.5% gap over the 4060 baseline card. As for older cards, the RTX 2070 is similar in performance to the modern 7600. The 7600 XT leads the 6600 XT by about 6%, so not particularly exciting. And that gives way to 1440p. The RX 7600 XT leads the baseline 7600 by 3%, with the 6600 XT about tied with the original 7600. Even if these are linked primarily by name, that's just a disappointing swing. The original launch MSRP of the 66 XT was $380, but we're going on 3 years since its launch and not much has changed. GTA 5 at 4K at least posts more of a change, but still not enough to justify the price. The 7600 XT gains 8% over the original 7600 here, moving from 54 FPS average to 58. That puts the 76 XT between the 4060's 63 FPS average and the 3060 XC's 57 FPS average. Intel's A750 doesn't do that well here, down at 31 FPS average. If anything, this test helps to show that Intel's GPU performance still isn't predictable in the same way NVIDIA and AMD options might be. Generally speaking, we can pretty accurately predict, for example, that a 7600 and a 4060 will be relatively close to each other, but the A750 still bounces around based on the game. Time for ray tracing testing. We'll start with our freshly re-added Cyberpunk with a mix of RT Ultra and RT Medium, leading with RT Medium. At 1080p with Medium RT, the RX 7600 XT and RX 7600 are about equal to an end user without upscaling. Upscaling mostly proportionally scales and is calculable, so you can factor that in if you'd like, but the difference here for baseline is about 11% for these results. There's no heavy constraint on VRAM here, at least not anything exceeding what the cards are already capable of. As for the RTX 4060, its lead is massive here, as discussed in the summary chart. We also saw that with the 7900 XT tying the 4070 here, and it gets worse as RT load increases with Ultra. You could make this work on the 7600 cards with upscaling and settings tuned down a little more, but for our purposes, we care about the difference between the devices, and NVIDIA does hold the lead. At 1440p and with medium still, the RX 7600 XT posts an 18 FPS average result. This is more of an academic exercise because the 7600 is actually struggling enough here that its FPS becomes less reliable, generally spikier, so we have less data to work with, and it's also starting to get overloaded as a card. Additionally, in situations of percent scaling, plus or minus 1 FPS at this range can have a bigger difference on what's calculated, so these tend to get exaggerated. Regardless, the XT is significantly improved here. Memory is never so simple though. The RTX 4060 has less than the new XT, but its baseline performance and ability to process RT helps it keep a lead. At 1080p Ultra, the RX 7600 XT and RX 7600 post similar scaling to the 1440p medium results. The 4060 leads the 7600 XT by 85% here. Again, with this higher RT load, NVIDIA is just scaling better. We saw similar massive leads for the 4070 Ti Super over the 7900 XT. Now for Dying Light 2 with ray tracing and at 1440p, here the RX 7600 XT ran at 31.3 FPS average, leading the 7600 by about 6.8%. It's on the higher side, but still not a huge swing for the price. The RTX 4060 runs this one at 41.5 FPS average, leading the 7600 XT now by 33%. 4060 Ti has an advantage of 70% over the 7600 XT, not distant from the 7700 XT. AMD 7600 series cards have a particular weakness in certain ray tracing tests, and that's showing here. At 1080p, we're seeing a 7.6% advantage in the 7600 XT over the original 7600. The cards still struggle though, ultimately landing below the Intel A750 and the RTX 4060. Both of which are the low 60s for frame rate. AMD is struggling to get up into the 50s with its 7600 series cards here. In Resident Evil 4 with ray tracing and at 1440p, the RX 7600 baseline performed at 65 FPS average, establishing an improvement of 2.8% for the RX 7600 XT. That puts the 4060 up at 71 FPS average, or 7% ahead of the 7600 XT. And at 1080p, the 7600 XT leads the 7600 by 2.2%. The 4060 is about 12% ahead of the XT in this one, and the gap isn't as wide here for an RT test as we've seen in some others like Cyberpunk or Dying Light. Finally, in flat-out 100% power consumption and fully maxed, which is similar behavior to what you'd see in a completely taxing render workload, we have the 7600 XT at 200 watts against the original 7600 non-XT's 163 watts. That's where a lot of the performance uplift is coming from. In situations where we did see 10 or 12% swings, like in Starfield and F1, it's derived from the added power budget more often than it is from the memory change alone. The VBIOS allowed up to 232 watts when overclocking, which had it roughly aligned with the much less efficient A750. NVIDIA's 4060 holds an overall efficiency advantage here. Frankly and simply put, this card is not particularly interesting and serves as a great reminder for everyone that more memory for cards of this class of performance, it's not going to fix the core challenge that they face, which is they're just not powerful enough to really leverage it. So there's one instance where we saw a breakout where it actually did matter. AMD provided some first-party numbers it had collected. I think it said like Doom with Ultra Nightmare or whatever. And anyway, there's a couple scenarios that are functionally one-offs. But for our perspective, there is a limit to what can be leveraged for that memory capacity and the amount of times you are likely to leverage it unless you're buying for a very specific use case. It just seems not worth the extra $70 or whatever it ends up being when this thing launches. The rest of the average 5 to 7% uplift we saw comes from power increase and clock increase. We really just can't recommend the 7600 XT. The 7600 is at least somewhat interesting. $270 is really the primary reason that it is. So as soon as you take away that price and you increase it this much, it does kind of eliminate most of the reasoning for buying a 7600 class. Even still, again, the 6700 XT is still kind of hanging in there. That's worth looking at. And this launch being flanked by super cards that at least had the courtesy to retain a price with the upgrade, or in the case of the 4080 Super, drop it, it makes it even harder to accept this card from AMD. But its biggest challenge, once again, as has been the challenge for AMD this entire generation, is AMD. It's fighting itself. There was so much 6000 series stock left in the market after the kind of crypto collapse with Ethereum mining dropping off and the COVID demand dropping off that they've just been contending with those price points of relatively good cards, especially at the price that they're sitting at now. And so you have $330 for a 6700 XT is worth looking at. The 6600 is still interesting. The A750 is, it's not one we can outright recommend. It's still in that sort of enthusiast, you have some troubleshooting experience and patience camp of recommendations. But ultimately, the 7600 XT is just surrounded by much more interesting options, we think, and it's not something we can recommend. So this one's a pass for us at the price. Maybe if it comes down, and it will, then we'll talk about it again. But for now, we'd pass. Simple as that. It is not the most offensive card that's launched in the last 2 years. It's just also not worth buying. So that's it for this review. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly, or go to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of these limited edition Disappointment PC 2023 shirts, where we are running low on stock, but the back of it's got a list the most disappointing hardware events of the year as a way to commemorate it and support our new expanded testing. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.